In the early hours of the day, Moscow's silence began to feel heavier than usual. Behind the official calm, something was shifting, not at the front, but deep within Russia itself. According to several senior sources, tensions between the Kremlin and its own regional elites have reached a level unseen in decades. What was once a tightly controlled vertical of power is beginning to fragment from within. The outward war, long projected as a show of unity, is turning inward. Throughout the morning, encrypted messages circulated among high ranking officials in Russia's eastern regions, coded instructions, sudden dismissals, unexpected transfers. Officially, these movements were described as part of routine administrative optimization, but insiders claim the real purpose is far more urgent, a quiet purge aimed at identifying potential defectors among the president's own allies. One source close to the presidential administration described the atmosphere bluntly. They no longer trust each other. Every conversation feels like a test. At the same time, a second crisis is unfolding, one that cannot be solved by loyalty checks or propaganda. Russia's Far East, stretching from Khabarovsk to Yakutia, is facing a demographic collapse so severe that some regions have begun importing labor from abroad under emergency terms. Birth rates have dropped by nearly half in just a few years, while male mortality continues to rise. Factories that once powered the defense sector now stand half empty. Villages that supplied thousands of conscripts have become ghost settlements. And behind the official statistics lies a quieter truth. The war has drained the East of its future. In public, Moscow speaks of stability and patriotism, but in private, officials describe something close to panic. Governors are holding confidential meetings on socio-political sustainability, a phrase that in bureaucratic language means only one thing: fear of unrest. According to regional aides, the central government recently demanded detailed reports on population mood, requesting data not only on economic hardship but on levels of trust toward federal institutions. They're not worried about protests, one insider said. They're worried about indifference. When people stop believing, control slips. Meanwhile, among Russia's powerful inner circle, subtle fractures are beginning to show. Several oligarchs, long considered pillars of the system, have quietly relocated their families abroad, disguising the moves as educational opportunities. Others are shifting assets through intermediary firms in Kazakhstan and the Gulf. Their loyalty remains intact in public statements, yet their actions tell another story, one of preparation for turbulence. In Moscow's financial districts, whispers of a post conflict transition are growing louder. No one defines what that means, but everyone senses it's coming. And as the day unfolds, one unsettling realization takes hold across Russia's bureaucracy. The war that once unified the elite under a single banner is now eroding the very foundations of that unity. What began as an external campaign has become an internal reckoning. The Kremlin may still control the headlines, but beneath them, a quieter story is emerging of doubt, fatigue, and the slow unraveling of loyalty. Those who follow these signals closely say this is only the beginning, because once power starts looking inward for enemies, the collapse of trust is no longer a possibility. It's already underway. By midday, the first visible signs of internal strain began to emerge. Regional news outlets in the Far East published a series of identical statements about stable demographic conditions and steady industrial growth. The language was mechanical, the timings suspiciously synchronized, Within hours, several of those statements vanished without explanation. To the untrained eye, it looked like a routine media adjustment, but in the context of Moscow's current anxiety, it was a clear signal. Someone in the chain of command had panicked. According to insiders in the Ministry of Digital Development, new directives were issued almost immediately. No publication on population statistics, no mention of labor shortages, no comparisons to pre war levels. Silence has once again become Russia's preferred form of governance, yet outside the official narrative, the data continues to leak. Analysts tracking internal migration report unprecedented movement out of Siberia and the Far East toward Moscow, St. Petersburg, and abroad. Whole regions are quietly emptying. The labor force that once sustained military production has thinned to dangerous levels. Experts inside the government warn that Russia is approaching a demographic tipping point, one that could undermine its economic and military stability for decades. It's not about birth rates anymore, said one of them. It's about survival capacity. There simply aren't enough people left to sustain the illusion of normalcy. In response, the Kremlin has begun reviving a language not heard since the Soviet era: mobilization of population resources. Officially, it refers to incentives for relocation, new family subsidies, and patriotic campaigns. But behind closed doors, the meaning is far less benign. Sources in two regional administrations confirm that draft offices have been quietly instructed to expand recruitment lists under civil service reallocation. It's a bureaucratic euphemism for selective mobilization, pulling able bodied men from struggling towns and shipping them westward under the guise of labor contracts. For many families, it means the same thing as before: another empty house, another father who won't return. Meanwhile, cracks within the elite are widening. Governors in several eastern regions are reportedly refusing to implement new population directives, citing lack of infrastructure and funding. Their resistance is subtle but dangerous, expressed through delays and administrative excuses. The Kremlin has responded by dispatching special envoys, a familiar euphemism for political overseers, to monitor compliance. But the tone of these missions has changed. Before, it was about loyalty, said one insider. Now, it's about fear of collapse. And beneath these bureaucratic maneuvers, a new layer of mistrust is spreading across Moscow's corridors of power. Key figures in the presidential administration have begun collecting dossiers not on opposition activists, but on each other. Private correspondence is being monitored, financial transactions traced, informal meetings photographed. Even among those closest to the president, paranoia has become routine. One official described the mood succinctly: no one knows where the purge will stop. The irony is cruel. The very system that once thrived on centralized control is now turning that control against itself. Every decree aimed at restoring order only deepens suspicion. Every show of loyalty conceals a private act of self preservation. It's a cycle that feeds on secrecy and fear, and it's accelerating. As evening approaches, one question echoes through the halls of power: if Moscow can no longer rely on obedience in the periphery, how long before it starts doubting obedience at the center? The answer, according to those watching from within, may already be unfolding, not through a single act of defiance, but through the quiet erosion of belief that the system can still hold together. By early afternoon, what had begun as whispers among regional officials turned into a pattern that Moscow could no longer ignore. According to confidential reports reviewed by several ministries, entire segments of the Eastern bureaucracy had begun slowing down operations, not in open defiance, but through silence, delay, and absence. Meetings postponed, requests unanswered, budgets under review. It's the kind of passive resistance that doesn't announce itself but quietly spreads through every layer of administration. They're not rebelling, said one senior advisor in Moscow. They're disengaging. In a system where obedience is the only currency, disengagement is the most dangerous form of betrayal. Inside the Kremlin, the response was immediate and defensive. Internal audits were launched to reassess personnel reliability, but in practice, that meant something far more sinister: loyalty interrogations. Officials were summoned without notice, their financial statements scrutinized, their private communications reviewed. In one ministry, even the tone of an internal email became grounds for suspicion. The logic is simple. When a system begins to fear its own servants, loyalty turns into performance. They all speak the same words, said a source familiar with the process, but none of them believe them anymore. At the same time, a new kind of intelligence began to surface, not from foreign adversaries, but from Russia's own economic institutions. Confidential briefings from the central bank describe structural anomalies in regional accounts, unexplained capital transfers, hidden reserves, sudden withdrawals. Analysts quietly suspect that local elites are moving funds abroad in anticipation of instability. Officially, these are routine market fluctuations. Unofficially, they are early indicators of an elite preparing for fragmentation. The numbers tell the story better than any speech. In just 2 months, over $2 billion in regional assets have been relocated to Central Asia and the Middle East under corporate cover. Yet, while Moscow chases shadows, the deeper crisis continues to unfold far from its marble halls. In the towns of Yakutia, Chita, and Birobidzhan, clinics report severe staff shortages. Teachers are leaving, doctors are disappearing, and entire departments are closing for lack of personnel. These are not the headlines shown on state television, but they are the quiet heartbeat of a country running out of people. The war took the young men, said one healthcare worker. Now it's taking everyone else. The government's promises of compensation mean little when there's no one left to claim them. Amid this slow collapse, one phenomenon stands out: the reappearance of fear in places long accustomed to silence. Local administrators speak in coded language during calls, avoiding names, switching to euphemisms like the situation or the matter. The fear is no longer of Western sanctions or Ukrainian advances. It's of Moscow's reaction to bad news. Each report of declining population or falling productivity risks being interpreted as disloyalty. So data gets altered, words softened, numbers delayed. The truth is managed until it disappears. But the consequences remain visible: empty streets, closed schools, and the quiet sound of decline. And yet, even in this climate, something unexpected is beginning to stir. Among mid level officials, those too small to be targets, yet too informed to be naive, a sense of realism is emerging. They see the system's weaknesses, the exhaustion of propaganda, the slow unraveling of authority. It feels like the center is looking for enemies that don't exist, one regional planner confided, while the real collapse is happening right in front of us. For years, Russia's power rested on the illusion that fear could hold everything together. But fear, once internalized, becomes uncontrollable. It corrodes from within. And as that corrosion spreads through the machinery of the state, the question is no longer whether betrayal exists, but whether anyone still believes in the system they're supposed to defend. If you're following this story, remember this moment: the shift from control to self survival. It may not look dramatic, but it's how every great structure begins to fall, not with revolt, but with quiet withdrawal. By mid afternoon, tension in Moscow had reached a level that even the state's policed calm could not disguise. Inside government buildings, aides moved with visible unease. Meetings that had been planned days in advance were suddenly rescheduled, while others were held behind closed doors with no minutes recorded. According to a source inside the presidential administration, a new directive had been issued. All communications between ministries must now pass through a special verification unit within the Security Council. The reason, though unstated, was clear: leads. Someone inside the system was feeding information outward, and the Kremlin no longer knew whom to trust. For those watching from within, this moment feels eerily familiar. Russia's political machine, once defined by its discipline, is now defined by its paranoia. Every silence is suspicious, every absence a potential defection. Reports from the Far East suggest that entire administrative chains have become paralyzed. Governors refuse to sign new demographic programs until Moscow confirms funding, while Moscow refuses to release funding until governors prove compliance. The result is a bureaucratic standoff disguised as efficiency. Everyone's waiting for someone else to make the first mistake. One official admitted, "No one wants to be next." Meanwhile, the population crisis continues to deepen, quietly, relentlessly. In Khabarovsk and Primory, regional hospitals have begun merging departments to cope with staffing shortages. Schools operate on reduced schedules. Recruitment centers report record absenteeism among conscription age men. Yet the state media continues to insist that the situation remains stable. Behind the curtain, internal memos paint a very different picture. Uncontrolled depopulation of peripheral regions may threaten the integrity of administrative management within the next 3 years. The phrase administrative integrity appears 3 times in the same report, underlined in red. In bureaucratic Russian, that is code for disintegration. The economic impact is no less alarming. Mining operations in Yakutia are running below half capacity due to labor gaps, while logistics corridors along the Trans-Siberian Railway have been disrupted by staff turnover. The data, if released publicly, would expose a truth Moscow has tried to avoid. The war is not only draining the front, it is hollowing out the country's interior. It's like a body bleeding from the inside. One economist close to the government confided, "The wounds are invisible, but fatal if left untreated." At the same time, within the Kremlin's own inner circle, subtle shifts are taking place. Several influential figures who once spoke confidently in meetings now remain silent. Decisions once made collectively are now being dictated from the top, often without explanation. The circle of trust around the president has narrowed to a handful of loyalists, most of them dependent on his survival for their own. Outside that circle, uncertainty reigns. Even senior ministers reportedly avoid informal gatherings, afraid that a careless phrase could be interpreted as disloyalty. The elite, once bound by shared profit, now hold together only through shared fear. And yet, the greater danger lies not in rebellion, but in exhaustion. Across the administration, Staff turnover is rising sharply. Mid-level managers, the invisible gears of governance, are resigning quietly, citing health issues or family reasons. In reality, many are simply choosing disappearance over participation. The Kremlin's greatest threat is not sabotage, it's apathy. The moment people stop believing that obedience matters, the machinery of control grinds to a halt. As the hours pass, Moscow's outward calm feels increasingly artificial. Behind every polished press release lies a growing awareness that the system is running on momentum, not conviction. It's like watching a ship that still glides forward, said a former government consultant, but the engines have already failed. By the end of the day, officials will still smile on television, the president will still appear in command, and the word stability will echo through the evening news. But those inside the system know what those words now mean: a pause before something irreversible. The war abroad continues, but the real conflict has already shifted homeward, silent and unacknowledged, unfolding in offices, statistics, and fears no one dares to name. As the day drew toward its uneasy close, Moscow's silence grew almost oppressive. The corridors of power, usually alive with the echo of command, seemed subdued, as if waiting for a signal that never came. Official statements spoke, as always, of stability and discipline, but within the ministries, the tone had shifted from confidence to resignation. Sources describe a capital holding its breath, aware that the machinery of governance is still running but without direction. Everything still functions, one insider said quietly, but no one believes in why. In the eastern regions, that disbelief has already turned into withdrawal. Reports arriving from Yakutia, Buryatia, and Khabarovsk paint a picture of quiet abandonment. Local administrations operate on autopilot. Social programs are delayed indefinitely. Even patriotic events, once obligatory, are being cancelled for technical reasons. What's left behind is a country still moving, but without purpose. People no longer argue, noted one regional sociologist. They just adapt to decline. That adaptation, silent, collective, and unplanned, may be the most dangerous development of all. Within Moscow's elite, the same pattern is taking hold, though cloaked in more refined language. High ranking officials now speak of strategic endurance instead of victory, long term adjustments instead of recovery. Behind these euphemisms lies a shared recognition. The system is not evolving, it's retreating. Key figures are protecting their futures, transferring assets abroad, cultivating discrete connections in neutral countries. They are not defecting, at least not yet, but they are preparing for a world in which Moscow's guarantees mean little. In private, one influential businessman put it bluntly: no one wants to be the last loyalist. At the same time, the population crisis that began in the Far East is creeping westward. Internal data shows that labor shortages, previously confined to remote regions, are now affecting central Russia. Logistics hubs, industrial zones, even the outskirts of Moscow itself. Trains are delayed, food prices rise, essential goods take longer to arrive. The state responds with slogans promising revitalization and unity, but the public has stopped listening. Each speech feels like a ritual performed by a government talking only to itself. They still speak as if we believe, said one observer in Vladivostok, but belief ended long ago. And yet, amid the stagnation, an unexpected shift is beginning to take shape. Small, almost invisible, but profound. In cities far from the Kremlin's reach, people are starting to organize quietly. Local committees, mutual aid networks, informal trade routes, not opposition in the traditional sense, but self organization born out of necessity. It's a form of life emerging from the collapse of control. The state, so obsessed with loyalty, never imagined what might happen once citizens stopped needing its approval. When fear fades, noted a former regional deputy, the silence changes meaning. It stops being obedience. It becomes distance. Inside the presidential administration, the mood has grown heavy. The day's final reports arrive, population figures, industrial shortfalls, migration statistics, and each one carries the same undertone of decay. Officials still sign their names, still issue directives, still smile for the cameras, but privately, many confess that the future they are managing no longer exists. The vertical of power remains, yet its foundations are hollow. What holds it together now is not strength, but habit, and as dust settles over Moscow, that habit feels increasingly fragile. The war that was meant to consolidate the nation has instead exposed its fractures. The allies who once swore loyalty now hedge their bets. The regions that once feared the center now quietly drift from it. And at the top, the man who once commanded absolute obedience presides over a country that still obeys, but no longer believes. By this hour, one truth has become inescapable. The collapse, when it comes, will not begin with protests or declarations. It will begin with silence, the kind that spreads through institutions, families, and entire regions until the structure simply stops responding. That silence is already here. It hums beneath the surface of every speech, every order, every loyal phrase repeated without conviction. The outward war may continue, but the real battle, the one for Russia's soul, is unfolding within its own borders in real time, and it has already begun. Stay with us. What we are witnessing now is not the end of a system, but the slow revelation of what it always was.